I'm Mikki, and this is Mikkipedia, where I sit down and chat to doctors, professors, athletes, practitioners, and experts in their fields related to health, nutrition, fitness, and well-being. And I'm delighted that you're here. Kia ora team, welcome to Mikkipedia. My name is Mikki, and this week on the show, I am stoked to bring to you this conversation that I had with two of my mates, a Mikkipedia regular, Dr. Cliff Harvey, and a returning guest, Dr. Eric Helms. So Cliff, Eric, and I sat down and had just a good old conversation about topics related to body composition, muscle mass, cutting for a physique show, where people might get it wrong with macros, and just some real practical sort of take-home tips for anyone that is interested in the whole body composition macronutrient counting space. We were really just chewing the fat on all things related, and I hope that you enjoy this conversation because it really was my opportunity to sort of pick the brains of two of the experts in the field who are so good at giving us really practical information. So for those of you who haven't caught up with any of Cliff or Eric's episodes, we will pop them in the show notes for today. But Cliff Harvey, he's New Zealand's expert on the effects of a ketogenic diet in a healthy population. And he's been helping people live healthier, happier lives and to perform better since starting in clinical practice way back in the 1990s. That was like last century, people. So he has worked with Olympic, professional, Commonwealth and other high-performing athletes in addition to just your everyday sort of people. And he's also worked with many people to overcome the effects of chronic and debilitating health conditions. So he has over 20 years experience as a strength and nutrition coach, and in addition to his PhD research, is a registered clinical nutritionist, qualified naturopath, and he's the owner of an education provider, Holistic Performance Institute, which is New Zealand's leading certification and diploma for health, nutrition, health coaching and performance. And it's one that I actually teach on, and we're just finalising the female athlete module to go out, hopefully by mid-year 2022. And Dr. Eric Helms is a coach, athlete, author, educator and podcast host. He's a trainer since the early 2000s, worked in the US Air Force, commercial gyms, private training studios, medical fitness and strength and conditioning facilities, and he is part of 3DMJ, where they coach drug-free strength and physique competitors at all levels. Eric himself has competed since the mid-2000s in natural bodybuilding, and he's also dabbled in powerlifting and Olympic lifting. Eric is also a multiple published, peer-reviewed author in exercise science and nutrition journals and writes for commercial fitness publication. He's taught at undergraduate and graduate level nutrition and exercise science courses, including Holistic Performance Institute with Cliff, and he is the co-host of Iron Culture, an awesome podcast which delves into all topics strength condition related. So he is also the co-founder of Mass Monthly Strength and Conditioning Review, and I subscribe to that. I absolutely love it. And is a research fellow for AUT at the Sports Performance Research Institute New Zealand. He's a guy with a lot of letters after his name. So we will of course put links to how to find Eric and Cliff in the show notes. Before we get on into the interview, I'd just like to remind you that the best way for you to support us, team, is to hit subscribe and give us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast platform. That would be amazing. And if you do want to go the extra mile, you can sign up to any one of my real food nutrition plans, my recipe portal access, or one of my fat loss plans over on Williden.com, where you not only get access to all my recipes, the ability for me to answer your nutrition related questions at any time, our written Q&A that happens weekly, my weekly email, and depending on what you sign up to, a monthly meal plan with shopping lists. And finally, just before we go, Monday's Matter is going to kick off again early May. Prior to that though, I do have a free webinar entitled If Not Fasting Then What, where I talk all about the strategies I use in Monday's Matter that are successful in helping people achieve their desired body composition and sort of lose the hunger and gain control over their food intake in a delicious way. So we'll put links to that in the show notes too. All right, team, enough from me. Let's hear from Dr. Cliff Harvey and Dr. Eric Helms. All right, team, we're on. Dr. Helms, Dr. Harvey, got to say thank you first for taking the time to jump back on Mikkipedia. Cliff is a Mikkipedia regular and one of the most popular guests. Not that I'm sort of positing that as some sort of competition, Eric, but I did.
That's going on backwards now, Dr. Williden.
Yeah, I did actually quite like the way that I put you both on my little Instagram post, and it reminded me of some WWF show sort of announcement before, but
you mean the World Wildlife Federation?
Worldwide Fund for Nature?
Just the hairiness of...
You look like a Worldwide Fund for Nature poster.
Mm-hmm.
Who are these animals?
So anyway, like you guys are... I said you're the OG in this whole space of macros, of physique, of weight loss, where things go right, where things go wrong.
Well, it's true because Eric invented macros and I invented physique. Yeah. People didn't have physiques
and
before
people couldn't build them before macros existed. So there you go. This protein has no protein in it because I don't know what macro is.
And people are always super interested to hear you guys talk about it. So I thought this would be a great opportunity to let them, but also for us just to have a conversation. I just got off the call from another academic who's currently based in Brazil, and she, after our conversation, she was like, "That was so great because all I love doing is sitting in a pub on a Saturday night and talking about research." And I'm like, "Don't we all?" But actually, we don't. Just geeks like us. So I'm glad you're up for it.
100% always.
Well, the last time we did a podcast and we agreed to have a beer, I think I was the only one having a beer.
That is true. What is your beverage of choice this morning? I don't think it will be beer at this time of the morning.
I'm going with H2O.
Yeah, I had coffee, but currently I have nothing in front of me because the coffee is now drunk.
I have had a lot of beverages this morning, though. I had a coffee like Eric, but I had lion's mane in that coffee and collagen. I then had a shake containing whey protein, exogenous ketones, MCTs, superstarch, berries, and oat milk.
Wow. You really sound like a biohacker.
Yeah.
Actually.
I invented biohacking, I think you'll find.
That sounds like a delicious mix. I've got in front of me the coffee, I've got a shake, and I've also got toast with cottage cheese. I quite like cottage cheese, quite like toast.
Wow.
It's my Friday usual.
This is like spoken Instagram.
Us sharing parts of our lives that no one cares about, but without the visual medium. Yeah. I love it.
Okay, so I'm going to start with one of my first questions that came through the DM. Team, what is hot off the press with regards to our understanding of physique, science, or whatever we want to call it? So what's new, what's relevant, what is something which is of interest right now?
Well, there was a recent paper. I mean, if we're talking like when I hear physique science, I think like physique sport, which probably isn't an interest of most people, but they're probably more interested in like body composition change. But there's an interesting study that we're reviewing in mass that's coming out next month on whether or not competitive bodybuilders can manipulate their intra to extracellular water ratio with some of their peak week protocols, where traditionally you'll see them loading carbs, loading potassium, cutting sodium, cutting water, doing a pump up, and some or not all of those factors together, depending on who you talk to. And it's an interesting study because they reported the highest intra to extracellular water ratios that are present in any literature on PubMed. And I found that quite interesting. And then as I dug into the methods, I found out that they used single frequency BIA, which and used estimations equations. So there's some real big limitations as far as your ability to estimate total body water. So I'm reasonably convinced that the directionality exists, but the magnitudes and the exact numbers, when you look at the math, looks a little funky. But anyway, it's a question that, so if you were to hang out with a bunch of bodybuilders, you're going to get people who lean more towards traditional wisdom, and you're going to lean more people who maybe have a more evidence-based bias. And I say bias, not just preference, because there's so little evidence on this at all. So I think it's understandable whichever way someone leans. But like the sciencey based response to someone going, "Hey, I do this peaking protocol so I can, reduce my extracellular water, increase my intracellular water, so I have less subcutaneous, fluid, blurring my definition, and I've got all in the muscle cells." They go, well, intra to extracellular water ratios are highly and tightly monitored and regulated in the body, and if you could manipulate them a lot, it'd be bad. And I'm suspicious of that claim, and I don't think you can really do what you think you're doing. And I've definitely been someone who's erred on kind of that side of the response. But this paper is at least making me go, interesting. I would like to see this replicated with perhaps more rigorous method, say multi-frequency bioimpedance spectroscopy, as well as maybe some additional hydration monitoring methods, because I think this is, unfortunately, the methods really leave a lot to be desired in this study. But it's intriguing. So that's something that just popped off the top of my head.
Eric, can I ask you a 101 question?
Yes.
So in peak week, and I see this, like I'm not a physique competitor or anything like that, but I've always been interested in the sport and seeing what people do. And I've always been really confused about the method of the sort of hydration loading, what you do with sodium. I know that, and what you do with carbs in that sort of couple of days leading up or week leading up. What is your protocol? And what do you do?
Yeah. So the traditional idea is that when you ingest carbohydrate, it gets stored as muscle glycogen and liver glycogen. And every gram of glycogen is stored with 3-ish to 4-ish grams of water that are bound with glycogen. And the idea is that when you do that and you carb load and you supersaturate muscle glycogen, you will have a visual change. So it's the same idea behind carbohydrate loading that endurance athletes use, but it's not for the purpose of increasing, metabolic substrates for high-intensity exercise. It is specifically to enhance appearance. And that is done often in conjunction with a controlled or restricted water intake. The idea is that the water must be bound with glycogen. And by the way, I'm presenting the argument, not necessarily that I agree with all aspects of it, and I'll tell you what I think makes sense and what I do. You restrict water, load carbs. Therefore, the body has to, quote unquote, pull water from other places, extracellular, subcutaneous, to be stored with the carbs in the muscle. And therefore, you're going to see an enhanced appearance and increase in definition because you're getting less water in the subcutaneous space, more inside the muscle. And then you combine this with loading potassium or eating potassium-rich foods, reducing sodium to try to enhance this effect of intracellular to extracellular water ratio increasing by trying to get the sodium-potassium pump leveraged. And you will even see on the untested side of the sport people taking prescription diuretics along with this. Insulin.
So getting rid of much fluid as possible.
Except that which supposedly is bound with muscle glycogen, so that you just have this dry but very hard and separated look. And I can tell you from my, this is going to make me sound old now, 15 years in the sport, that like 80% of the time people will say they do this and they don't look better, or they sometimes look worse. It seems very inconsistent, especially at the amateur level. And one thing I have pretty much consistently seen is that when people mess a lot with their electrolytes, they just don't look right. And I think some of the assumptions that are baked into this don't make sense. Like intracellular is not necessarily perfectly synonymous in all situations as intramuscular. And extracellular is certainly not synonymous with subcutaneous. As an example of some things that you probably wouldn't want to change in the way that are suggested, your vascular system is extracellular. So by reducing sodium, and by the way, we all know what happens when you're really dieted and you are low energy availability and very low in body fat. You typically see very low blood pressure. And it's, you stand up while you're dieting sometimes and you get a little lightheaded. That's exacerbated when you've been dieting for like 6 months to 4% body fat if you're male or something like that. It's very difficult to get a pump. So you can imagine that trying to get a pump when you're cutting sodium and restricting water intake, it doesn't really happen. And there's a lot of people who are really struggling to get that effect. So you probably wouldn't want to limit to the blood supply to muscles as a way to enhance their hardness and separation. Another interesting thing is that the GLUT4 transporter in the gut for carbohydrate is sodium dependent. So I sometimes do wonder if people who experience bloating and don't seem to fill out that well, it's because they're severely restricting sodium while trying to load carbohydrates. So I think sometimes people just do a whole too much and they can't separate all these variables they've changed in the final week from what is doing what and what isn't doing what. So generally I lean on the things that really do make sense and have the highest potential cost, or I should say benefit to cost ratio. So some interesting things. Another assumption, and this is taking far too long to talk about a very niche sports protocol, but I'll try to be quick. The idea that there's always 3 to 4 grams of water bound with glycogen, that's kind of a minimum. There's actually been some research in carb loading endurance athletes where they do it in a hypohydrated state or a hyperhydrated state. And you can actually see upwards of something like 18 to 19 grams being stored in the muscle, not necessarily glycogen bound. And how that affects appearance, I don't know. Those are limitations. But you can actually have a very well-hydrated muscle if you are well-hydrated and also carb loading to a greater extent than if you were not carb loading and were well-hydrated, or if you were carb loading or were dehydrated. So, and that comes back to that whole intramuscular versus intracellular idea. Like if Cliff, you might have noticed this. Let's say that the day after an upper body workout, you're a little sore. I tend to look a little more muscular, whether that's edema and hydration. But I'm pretty sure that is intramuscular, but not intracellular. What I'm seeing the day after I was to do like a high volume upper body workout, I look good for like 24 hours. And I would suspect that is related to some soreness and swelling post-workout. It makes me look better, but is like just an example of the lack of equality between intramuscular and intracellular in some cases. And so anyway, I typically don't restrict sodium at all. If anything, sometimes I'll increase it to try to see if I can get a little bump in blood pressure. I typically do carbohydrate loading, as that is, I think it does make sense. And there's nothing that really doesn't make sense about it. And we actually do have some quasi-experimental data showing it enhances appearance. There was a study by Marais, I'm probably mispronouncing that, I think last year or the year before, that came out. This is a cool study design. They grouped these bodybuilders into whether or not they used carb loading or not. This is quasi-experimental, so they weren't intervening, but they separated them observationally on those who did or didn't. And they used their photo silhouettes and gave those to judges, so they couldn't identify who the competitor was, but they were able to compare whether or not they looked more muscular from the photo silhouettes. And they rated the carb-loaded group as having improved their appearance more. And then they also did things like circumference measurements, muscle thickness, which seemed to improve in that carb-loaded state. So carb loading probably works, and I've always anecdotally noticed it has. But I have seen effects of, and we know this, muscle is a huge part of it is water. So being dehydrated, I don't think it's a good idea. I don't think it's a good idea to be low in sodium. So generally what I do is more or less just carb load, and sometimes I'll bump sodium a little bit and then maintain a normal to higher water throughput. Because I don't really see an issue with drinking a lot of water because you just pee more, So anyway, that's generally what I do. And it's something I will also test sometime in the 8 weeks out or earlier mark to make sure that it actually plays out that way. And the final caveat I'll say is that I work with drug-free bodybuilders. It is very possible that this is a different equation and that this is a tradition passed down for good reason from the enhanced side of the sport, where they could be taking very androgenic drugs and seeing a lot of hormone-mediated water retention where they do actually improve their appearance from cutting water and show.
Ah, that's a really good distinction, actually. Thanks, Eric. Like, I've always been interested to understand that process a little bit more, and you actually gave me a perfect opportunity to figure that out or find that out. Cliff, how about you? Anything new and interesting in the physique science space, whatever you call it? And of course, I know Eric goes to the actual what it actually is, science of bodybuilding, whereas I'm just more talking about body recomposition, weight loss, anything like that.
Yeah, I think broadly that the more we learn, it's almost as if we kind of understand that it's not that complicated. Whereas back in the day, we might have thought there were all these fine things we could adjust that would have really big effects. I think the more we're studying this, the more we realize that those small changes might result in very small effects for some people, but overall there are some really big fish to fry, and that's what we should focus on. And so I think that's what the research is showing more and more. So I would say it's more about a sort of broad overview and what it's telling us in general, which in many respects simplifies the game for people. And by the game, I don't mean the game of physique sport necessarily, but the game of body composition, recomposition, all that kind of stuff. So I kind of think that a lot of what we know about body composition has been known in general terms for a long time. If you read works by people back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, a lot of it was pretty congruent with what we would know now about modern sort of bodybuilding or body composition science.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the big rocks have been in place for a long time. There's somewhat of a kind of an evidence-based meme versus the bro science meme. And I think people have expectations because the evidence-based kind of community has all these ideas that are all potential like trivial effect sizes combined to get one small effect size. And then they do all of that, and then they see their buddy maybe has better genetics than that, making better gains, not paying attention to those variables. And they think they're doing nothing that's evidence-based, but in reality, they are not doing the things that are currently popular in the evidence-based community, but all the most important evidence-based things they are doing. Like, it's not like the quote-unquote bro science people or people who are more traditionalist are going, you know what? I don't want to see any progressive overload. I want to see your training get easier over time. I need you to do less sets or reps or load or get further from failure week to week. And let's avoid all of those exercises that train your muscle groups. We'll just do strange ones that do nothing. And let's get that protein intake down below 1 gram per kg. And when you want to cut, be in a surplus. When you want to be in a deficit, that's when you're trying to gain muscle. Like, that's not what bro scientists are doing. They're generally following a progressive, hard training protocol with a high protein diet, eating in a surplus when they're trying to put on muscle, eating in a deficit when they're not. So they've got everything that really matters in place. You could argue they could train each muscle group a little more frequently, but we know that's a very small impact and really just a vehicle for volume distribution. We know maybe they shouldn't always be training to failure, but the data would suggest that you can get away with, training to failure. And it's kind of idiot-proofing the program at the very least. That you're putting forth a sufficient stimulus. Might not be the most efficient thing in the world. A lot of what I think Cliff was getting at is that understanding some of the things that you do and don't have to do can make your life a little less stressful. Maybe you can reduce the, disordered eating patterns you have, or maybe the masochistic relationship you have with your body in the gym. And maybe you'll be more sustainable in the sport, more efficient with your time. But I think a lot of what quote unquote bro science is thinking that, every day I pray to the sun and it comes up, probably got to keep praying to the sun. But it's not like they are, it's not harmful. It's just maybe a narrative that is incorrect, and some things that are less efficient or unnecessary, but typically not actively harmful if you're especially looking at the kind of tradition-based anecdotal bodybuilding or physique stuff where people are paying attention and doing what seems to work in the trenches. They often get the directionality right, but maybe the magnitude's off. Like, yeah, we eat 3.5 grams per kg of protein. It's like, well, you could do 2.5 and probably be just as good, but you got the whole higher protein than the RDA recommendation down right, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And there is, interindividual variability. So who knows? Someone might benefit from 3 or 4 grams protein per kilo body weight and someone else 1.4. It's that's one thing I think that's often missed by the evidence-based community, is that it's always regression to the mean. What works best for people is assumed to work best for a person. And as practitioners, we know that while there's not that much variability because people are people, right? Homo sapiens are Homo sapiens, but there can be some pretty interesting differences between people, particularly in terms of macro splits or, maybe training volume. And that's all impacted, obviously, by not just physiology, but the psychosocial milieu. So there's a lot of variability there. And I kind of take the position where we need to obviously look at the evidence. That's clear. We need to be evidence-based. And we should probably have as our benchmark what the evidence tells us in terms of those sort of population norms. However, for an individual, we need to move from that very rapidly as required, because it may not work well for that person. And like I say, it could be for a range of reasons and not just the physiological.
At least in the bodybuilding world, I think that that's an issue that's not just on the evidence-based side. The traditionalists generally go, who's the biggest, like what is Mr. Olympia doing right now? Or what is the most popular coach doing right now? And it is often what worked well for them or some of their elite level clients. And then everyone simply mirrors the elite, which when you actually think about it, doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because there's only one Mr. Olympia and there's thousands of skinny teenage kids training like that who aren't getting great gain. So does that even make sense? Probably not. And I would say that anyone who is actually an evidence-based practitioner is, by definition, focusing on individual differences, because that is one of the three-legged aspects of the stool. But I would say that the people who have they're really just kind of like pseudoscience interested, or let's say we'll call them hardcore empiricists who are actually quite naive to individual differences, and they assume that the means that are reported in the research are the most common response, or the response that an individual would suspect. They're not evidence-based. They're probably just focusing too much on science and misapplying it, while the actual evidence-based approach is counting for individual differences and preferences, as well as experience, and having a scientific-based approach. So that's actually something that I do think is coming out more and more in research, is that while we are starting to understand exactly like Cliff said, that we kind of have the big rocks understood and have for a while, the more we can have open science and reporting the individual participant level data, and the more that we can try to manipulate these things and use cool study designs to like crossovers, or my favorite, within subject designs, where like one leg is doing one thing and another leg is doing the other. So you've controlled for the genetic differences and the environmental differences for the person. Then you see some really cool shit. Like just to throw a little cool finding out there. There's a recent study by DeMoss and colleagues that came out where they reanalyzed some data they had from another study, and every person was randomized into having one of their legs trained 2 to 3 times per week, doing a total of 6 to 9 sets of leg extensions and leg press to failure, if I recall correctly. For the other leg, which trained for 15 total sets, 5 times a week. So you're looking within person at using a moderate to low volume versus roughly twice that on average, a higher volume approach. And within the same person, sometimes you would see that they were getting 2 to 3-fold the gains in either strength or hypertrophy, which didn't always go the same way for a person. I mean, they might have done better with higher volume for strength and lower volume for hypertrophy, or vice versa, versus the other leg. Meaning that while we might generally advise, hey, why don't you start your lifting career with, say, 8 to 12 sets per muscle group, that might be really insufficient for some on an individual level basis, and it might be really perfect for someone else, or it may not nearly be enough or too much. And while the means are actually quite different, quite subtly different and often non-significant when you compare moderate to high volumes. When you then look at the individuals, sometimes you can see people who it is a completely different experience for them, as far as being, I'm a non-responder or a low responder versus I'm a high responder. And I'm not saying that if I just found the right program, I would be Ronnie Coleman. But what I am saying is that someone who has been making inconsistent progress might be kind of the best version of themselves while, the people who are genetic freaks are going to make either amazingly progress or even amazingly better progress for them. So, of course, the biggest factor is going to be someone's individual genetics. But whether or not you can reach your potential does seem heavily dependent on individual factors. And I think that's becoming something that's more and more studied. And just by the nature of the open science movement, we can get actual access to that, and researchers can leverage that and report individual participant level data. And I think that's, while it's not a finding, Mikki, I think it's probably the next horizon for really interesting data collection. And I think the first step is just identifying that there's these massive individual differences that practitioners already know about, but quantifying it and then hopefully developing protocols which can prospectively identify people so we can better guide the guidance we give instead of having to go through a lengthy trial and error process, or as lengthy.
So, Eric, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. Within bounds, do you think it really makes that much difference for, let's say, most people most of the time, if they're changing their, let's say, volume and or frequency even quite considerably? Like, let's say you take someone who's training a la, Mark Chalet twice a week, just a few sets warming up to basically a heavy max, versus someone training like, I don't know, Bill Pearl. Do you think if they're applying progressive overload and they're consistent with that, and let's say ceteris paribus applies, all other things are remaining equal in terms of lifestyle and nutrition, do you think over the long term there would really be that much difference?
Absolutely. And I think while these 8-week studies that I'm referring to by DeMoss doesn't indicate that, there are other studies, like there's one by Scarpelli and colleagues, which I just recently got to see the individual data from. Or what they did, similar study design, and they had one leg assigned to 20% more sets than the person was historically doing. So they interviewed all the participants to be like, hey, what are you currently doing? And like, oh, I'm doing 20 sets per week. Okay, you're going to go up to 24. And then the other group just did a standardized 22 sets. So the individualized group made about 1/3 more progress at the group level. And I thought that was cool. And it goes, okay, individualization is better. If we're going to make a volume bump, we shouldn't just arbitrarily go to 22 sets, which is more than the group mean. But it's actually a reduction for some people, or the same to what you are doing for others. But if we make an individualized increase, we get better results. But that pales in comparison to when you look at the individual participant data, where sometimes you'll see someone who went to 22 sets and their increase in cross-sectional area is like 0.3%. But then you find that they were actually doing 12. When they go to 14 sets, it's 14%. So, this study is making people look like that guy in Lady in the Water, has one jacked arm in Night Shyamalan movie. This may not be a reference that makes any sense, but he only trains one arm. But anyway, there was a few, maybe a third of the participants who you were seeing 6 to 7-fold differences in the one leg versus the other. And that, in combination with DeMoss and combination with some of the other studies that are out there that look at aspects of individualization, and what I've seen, some people can be plateaued for a very long time, especially if they're in the camp of a higher volume or a lower volume approach. But generally, what my approach would be, which kind of still I think lines up with what you're saying, Caliph, is that I would start someone on the low to moderate volume and range, and then if they plateaued, I know what the reason is. Right? If we have a relatively high intensity, but the volume is insufficient, I would, crank that volume lever and see what happens and try to find their upper and lower bounds where they can progress, periodize between those 2 points. But I have seen people who absolutely thrive on those lower volume approaches. And I've also seen people who try a low volume approach and literally shrink despite the fact that they're training hard. So I think it can make a very big difference for some individuals.
So with regards to my training, right, since I've got both of your ears, I like to sort of subscribe to the chaos theory. So I'm in my home gym and I'm on my exercise cycle looking at Instagram.
You're not talking Joe Weider's muscle confusion, are you?
Oh, I might be. And I'm like, what will I do today? And then I just look at someone on Instagram like Eric and go, oh, is that what Eric's doing? I might try that. And then I'll go and I'll do a version of Eric's workout, albeit not train nearly as hard. Because I certainly don't look the way you do when you train. I'm much more calm and sort of have it together. Not that you don't, but you know what I mean. And then like on a Friday, I might be scrolling through Instagram and see Bella do her training and go, oh, I might do those 5 deadlifts that Bella just did and call that a day. So is there any merit to me with my chaos theory? Like, is there any sort of metabolic advantage? Is there just no point? Because of course, the message that I see on Instagram from other people that I follow is, if you're not doing progressive overload, if you're not following a training protocol for 12 weeks, then don't even bother. All bearing in mind, of course, I'm not trying to be a physique athlete. I'm actually just sort of doing something to try to maintain a little bit of strength.
I think there's a couple of points that I want to jump in and make. One is that done is better than perfect, right? So if the difference between someone, like novelty is really important for some people and for others it's not. And if someone is being told that, hey, you should just stick to the meat and potatoes, just deadlift, bench, squat, maybe do some pulls, and that's all you should do as a beginner or novice or whatever, and they really hate that, of course it's not going to work, right? So that's where I think often we miss the cultural, the behavioral, the psychosocial milieu around training, and that's really important. Having said that, I do think progressive overload is really important, and I think a lot of people do train relatively unintelligently. And it's not that you're doing that necessarily, Mikki, because I think you can still get progressive overload within some amount of chaos, right? Because you're still doing movement patterns, and if you're getting stronger in the patterns over time, that's progressive overload. What I tend to see as more worrying, not worrying, it's not worrying, I don't care, but what I see as more challenging for people's long-term progress is the sort of Energizer Bunny mentality. I want to just go in and do like high-intensity interval training or just move around a lot, wave my arms in the air and burn a whole bunch of calories and expect for that to give the optimal sort of long-term results. And I think in that respect, we've lost a lot of the focus on the real value of progressive strengthening of the body. And I think strength trumps everything else when it comes to sort of long-term outcomes. It's not to say it's the only thing that's important, but I think if we looked at it in terms of a hierarchy of what's most effective, we would say progressive strength training is probably the most effective thing. And I'll leave it there, but I think as a bit of a teaser, I think that's one of the things that I see out there a lot is that exercise is ineffective for fat loss. It's all about diet. And I just don't think that's the reality, because I think temporally it's critical, and I think it's incredibly protective over the long term, especially if you haven't just been waving your arms around to somehow try and burn calories, but if you've actually been growing and strengthening the body.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think it really just comes down to the audience and the goal. Like, I'm never worried about people like you, Mikki, who enjoy being physically active, like training, trying new things. And you may have described yourself as, you don't push yourself as hard as it appears that I do in my stories, but you probably push yourself hard enough to get a decent workout, and that would be amazing. Like if everyone did that, we would have healthcare costs that were, a quarter of what they are currently, and people would be playing with their grandkids in their 80s and making it to their 80s quite regularly, So, I think this really just comes down to messaging. Like if I was to get on my platform and say that, and I probably have said things like that, like, hey, program hopping is not something you want to do. Let's get away from the leader confusion principle, as Cliff said, which is a real thing, a real bad thing for the audience that they were trying to communicate to, bodybuilders,
Yes.
And you probably want to stick with something until it is no longer working, and then shift. I would say that knowing that my audience is
sorry, my muscles were confused.
Yeah, I think like what is going on? Yeah. So I'm saying that because my audience are primarily people who are trying to get unreasonable levels of muscle mass and strength, or competitive levels. And but yeah, I think if I was Mr. Health Guy, which I'm not. I am very interested in people having a long-term, sustainable, enjoyable career in strength and physique sport, but it's still strength and physique sport,
Yeah.
So I think, to me, it's just an audience question. And I think it's actually difficult for someone in the general population to get a negative effect from, like just kind of switching it up and following people all the time. But if someone was like, hey, I'd really like to enhance my fitness, I wouldn't advise to them to randomly select things based upon what's on their feed and then give it a, half-assed effort. Like that wouldn't be the optimal approach, but it all depends on what are you doing? What are you trying to accomplish? And I do think the most important thing is they should be enjoying it. And presumably strength and physique athletes, they like doing strength and physique things. And their primary goal is progress rather than, finding something that has a lot of novelty on a day-to-day basis. That said, I have run into many strength and physique athletes who do like novelty. And that's something you take into account because it can drive their motivation. But you need to have certain things in place that enable that monitoring of progress.
And that's, I think, with the longevity aspect, and I'm not talking about, longevity in terms of the way most people talk about it, but in terms of having that healthgevity, if you will, that quality of life through the health span. I do wonder, especially as I'm now,
middle-aged.
I'd say well into my 40s. I'm not really well into my 40s, but I'm middle-aged, mid-40s kind of thing. And, especially coming back to a bit of competition now. I do find it interesting, the idea that when we're young, we move a lot in different planes. And we're very, assuming we're active, we have very good structural integrity, and posture and mobility through ranges of motion and things. I wonder if, as strength athletes, we do pattern ourselves a little bit to not move so well in those planes, and there could be some sort of postural and structural breakdown over time. We certainly see a lot of strength athletes who do suffer as they get older with a lot of those sort of chronic degenerative type joint conditions and things. So part of me also looks at that, and while I think that if you did just the meat and potatoes and you focused on strength through a full range of motion, I think it would take care of most things. I do think there are certain movement patterns that are a little bit lacking. And because of that, I do think that a lot of people just don't move enough. It doesn't need to be a huge amount, but they don't move enough in terms of residual activity, walking around, just getting up and moving through the day, and especially moving in those different patterns like lateral movement, which is very lacking in strength sports.
There's data on that would support what you're saying, at least broadly. Cliff, there was I want to say a 2019 meta-analysis. I'm not going to remember the author, so I guess just telling someone the year won't help either. But what they did was they, instead of looking at activity as a one-factor variable, they broke up sedentary time as well as activity. And when you looked at the people who had I think their tertiles, the highest tertile of high-intensity activity, there was still a negative effect of being in the moderate and higher tertile of sedentary behavior. So I think this is something that's more and more common, and that I see a lot, especially as an online physique athlete coach, because the people I'm working with are going to be internet biased, I guess. I mean, that's almost just not even a thing in 2022 if everyone's on the internet. But a lot of people are essentially, and we've seen this with COVID as well, working from home, not if they go somewhere, they're driving, and they generally they struggle to get 5,000 steps a day, but they work out 5 times a week. And I notice in myself when I've been like that, as well as in my athletes, things just don't respond as well. They're more injury prone. They're less happy. They're more likely to catch ill. So the all-cause mortality data in that meta-analysis would suggest the same thing. And we've got a lot of data on the independent effect of just sedentary time now. There was even a observational, so limited data, but there's an observational study where they looked at athletes, so competing athletes and real athletes, not strength and physique athletes. People are doing training with aerobic and anaerobic work and multi-dimensional movements through space, practices and things like that. And those who reported more screen time and more sedentary time tended to have slightly higher body fat levels and were slightly less. I think their stress levels were a little higher, and there were a number of markers that indicated you could argue their overall health was less. So I think that's something that's important, is that activity and exercise, especially high intensity exercise, are not the same thing. And the way to conceptualize it, I think, is the more time spent being sedentary, there's actually a somewhat independent signal there. And then the amount of activity you do, there's a signal there. And of course, they're affecting the same outputs, health, but they are actually independent signals. So the way you would probably get the best of both worlds is trying to get kind of a minimum baseline of activity to actually remove risk, which from what I've seen, like even if just getting like 7,000 steps a day for most people is going to, be
and they're also interdependent, right? Because let's say you're currently not getting in that 7,500 steps a day, and instead you're sitting on your phone. It may well be that that's sort of pushing you over that threshold. And I think from memory, it's around 3.5 hours. They've sort of indicated in the research as a possible sort of threshold for online sort of use in a day before it starts negatively affecting other outcomes.
Sure.
But then, of course, that's interrelated with sleep. Sleep is obviously affected by nutrition, but it has a massive interplay with nutrition as well. If we don't sleep well, we tend to snack more the following day. We tend to make poorer choices with our snacks. Our food control is more greatly affected, all that kind of stuff. And so I think there's probably a substitution effect as well as the independent effect of activity and movement.
Yeah, absolutely. We are operating within a finite 24 hours per day, so there's no way then not to impact each other. So no, I totally agree. I think you would behoove yourself to consider kind of a long-term athlete development model, if you will, applied to even strength and physique sport athletes, of kind of having a base and then only becoming more specific. But maybe thinking of that almost more holistically throughout the whole lifespan of the athlete. A funny anecdote is when I was focusing on trying to, in the same year, do a strongman comp, a weightlifting comp, and a powerlifting comp, and I was doing a lot of variation in my training, I was the most beat up, but I also felt the most bulletproof, if that makes sense.
Interesting on that, the accrual of steps and just general sort of non-exercise activity. Do you guys see with the people you work with that people overestimate the amount that they move every day? If you're working with people and they've sort of stalled with regards to weight loss, and that's one of their primary sort of goals, and then you dig a little deeper and they're like, no, I'm super active because I do XYZ in terms of my training. But when you do sort of a bit of an audit, if you like, on energy, and I heard someone talk about this on the Stronger by Science podcast a couple of weeks ago, that actually they've completely overestimated the amount of things that they do on a day-by-day basis. They're sort of, I'm not going to say delusional, but just exactly that. They just equate active with their one structured activity and don't even think about everything else in the rest of the day.
I think is what I see a lot is people, when I ask them, do you exercise? Just as a very general question, it's like, I walk the dog every day. And I sort of think, well, that's great. I mean, I'm really stoked that someone's doing that because that's probably providing a bit of that foundation of residual movement. And it's obviously good for a whole bunch of reasons, particularly if they're going out to a park or in the bush or whatever, that sort of green spaces idea. And being with a dog outside is a great thing for mental health anyway. So there's all those benefits, but it's not really, exercise in the same way that I think we would usually think about exercise targeted towards progressive outcomes. Because, let's say if I go for a walk around the block with the dog, I might have done 2,000 or 3,000 steps. Mm. And I sit at home a lot in front of a computer. So I probably, if I didn't do anything else, I'd probably only do about 2,000 steps. So still, even though I think I'm exercising, I'm probably getting like 4,000 or 5,000 steps, which is, it's just not anywhere near enough. And there's also no progression there. There's no overload. There's no sort of strengthening of the body. There's none of that element. Plus as well, I think people then drastically overestimate the effect of that in terms of like energy balance. Mm. I went for a walk, so I obviously burned a lot of calories and they didn't really. So therefore, even if it's implicit or subconscious, they think, well, I've got a little bit more freedom as well now.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's actually a lot of different lines of evidence that tie to this, Mikki. There's the first one that just suggests that people are generally a little too, I wouldn't say delusional, but optimistic about the amount of calories in food. Because I don't think they're actually trying to delude themselves. I think they're too optimistic about the calories in food. They think it's lower than that actually is, or they just forget some of the shit they ate in a day. But there is data to suggest that on average, and there's a lot of variation, that someone generally thinks calories, especially when they eat out, are about half of what they actually are.
Mm-hmm.
But more than that is that the very reductionist kind of additive model of thinking about the calories burned in this hour, and normally I eat this much, and therefore that's an additional expenditure, has a lot of issues with it. So for one, sometimes it's just a math error. Like if you think, oh, I burn. Let's say you're accurate, and you said I burned 300 calories in this hour of training, which is not an unreasonable thing for an average weight person. You're then thinking, oh, I normally burn 2,000 calories a day, so today I burned 2,300. And you kind of have to go hold the phone. What do you normally? Do you have 23 hours in a day or 24? And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, so that
are you usually dead while you're
yeah,
exercising?
exactly. So like that hour, you normally burn calories, and they're like, well, what are you normally doing around that time? I'm like, oh, like housework. Like, okay, so you're normally actually burning 100 calories, so it's really only an additional 200, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
So that's the first misstep, but there's like three more. The next misstep, which is unfortunate, is that as you push activity levels higher, we see compensations in other areas. So this is that constrained energy model. But more accurately is somewhere between, depending on the individual and how high you try to push activity, maybe between 50 to 75% of the energy you expend from exercise activity or even non-exercise activity will actually count and be additive towards it. And the more you do, the more it starts to kind of curve and start to flatten out. And then finally, there is also data to suggest that, and this differs between individuals, that the natural state of things, unless you're controlling calorie intake, is that energy intake and energy expenditure are coupled, which is a good and a bad thing. So when you are sedentary, there is this uncoupling effect. And this has been known for a long time. There's a classic study on Bengali mill workers where you see the same energy intake between the most active the most active factory workers and the office managers who are sedentary. So they just weighed more, right? But then you look at every step down in terms of the people who are active, but to various degrees in the factory, they had a coupling in energy expenditure and energy intake and a similar mean body weight, right? So it's a great thing to start coupling your energy intake. You might just lose a little bit of body weight initially and then plateau if you're currently sedentary, because you're having this dysregulated satiety, if you will, and overeating a little bit, which might be part of the reason why someone might be higher in body mass. So once you start being active, that gets re-regulated, you stop overeating, and at the very worst case scenario, it is halting weight gain, which is actually a great thing in the modern environment. So that's sometimes the myopic view of exercise does nothing, I think, is quite overstated. It's too energetic of a focus rather than this homeostatic regulatory, metabolic benefit that I think is clearer. So anyway, you're not burning as many calories as you think for mathematical reasons because you're just adding it up wrong. You're potentially not adding all those calories to your day because there's compensations. And then if you're doing enough activity, great news, you're now coupling your energy intake with energy expenditure. But that means that if you do more activity, you're probably just going to eat more. So unless you're also actively trying to control calorie intake or making more satiating decisions with your food intake, cardio just doesn't give the same kind of oomph for most people that they would expect, which can be quite depressing if you don't understand that, which is why those energy audits are so important, Mikki.
Yeah, no, great point. Cliff, anything?
Oh, no, I mean, I agree with that. It's, that idea that, well, one thing I would say, though, is I think one area that we've sort of investigated in the past, or that Eric and I at least have discussed quite a lot, is this idea that, I don't know whether I came up with it or not, but I tend to talk about it more than anyone else I hear around. And that's that auto-regulation of energy intake. So based on almost a more qualitative approach to our food, if we're eating, rather than hyperpalatable, ultra-refined foods, if we're sticking more with the less refined foods, if we're having enough protein, if we're taking sort of a slightly modular approach to our meal planning, we tend to have an auto-regulation effect where it's very difficult to overeat. And so I would imagine that coupling of energy intake, where obviously if we're more active, we're going to desire more food. If we're in a good food environment that has a lack of those hyperpalatable, ultra-refined foods, it's likely that it will kind of work out. I think the thing that gets in the way for us in the modern world is we obviously have a desire for more food. And I think just on a biochemical basis, we're going to go for those foods that are most dense in calories, that have a combination of, the pleasure points, sugar, salt, fat, all together. It makes sense. If we're active in a natural environment, we would want those foods. So I think there is a mitigating effect when we really focus on the quality aspect of nutrition as a bit of a foundation, not the only thing, but a foundation.
100% agree.
Yeah, no, nice. And with regards to that sort of constrained energy model, what I also see a lot on my Instagram feed are two things. One is more and more people are talking about this so-called metabolic adaptation. And I think, Eric, with how you've just sort of talked through where people get it a bit wrong in terms of the energy audit, I think it's debatable whether there is an adaptation or more just a misunderstanding or a sort of miscalculation. On the flip side, though, in order to get out of a metabolic adaptation, to get away from chronically low calories and help sort of restore some of that potential or restore metabolism, there's that whole concept of reverse dieting. And it's something which I have seen a lot in the physique world. And Eric, you and I spoke of it when you came on maybe about a year ago. We talked about it. But more and more, just your general every sort of day person is saying, I've been on chronically low calories for so long. My metabolism is broken. I'm going to reverse diet myself out of this so I can enjoy this 3,000 calories a day and still effortlessly lose weight. Because, of course, all you see in that space are those people that have some magically, this is sort of the space they're in. Is it a magic cure?
Sounds like the new keto.
I know. But is it? Is there something, are we drawing too much of a sort of long bow here? Is that actually the reality for people who reverse diet? Like, what's your understanding of that? Like, both of you, if you've got any sort of thoughts on it, I'd love to hear it, because I'm just seeing it all the time.
I've done it, and I think we used to try to do it with our clients, and I know exactly those before and after examples that you look at, and they take themselves when they're in the hardest part of their diet, at their leanest and most depleted, and they post their calorie intake and their macros, and then they post themselves after they've gained a couple kilos, but a lot of it is just filling out, water, maybe a little bit of fat gain, but also some muscle regain. And the highest they get their calories at that point. And they look maybe slightly less lean, but better overall qualitatively. And oftentimes they're smiling in one, not the other. They're lighting all the standard 1990s EAS, like Bill Phillips before and after tricks that have been around since the dawn of photography.
I love any reference to Bill Phillips, actually, to be fair.
You got to, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, and they are definitely positioning something. It's a post to convince, right? And you look at it, maybe one's 1,800 calories and the one's 3,000 calories, right?
Yeah.
My God, that's amazing. But it actually all makes a lot of sense. They were in a 500 calorie deficit at a lighter body weight on the left, and they're in a slight surplus at a slightly higher body weight on the right. And they are in a adapted state in both cases. One is they are, sometimes the degree to which that has occurred is debatable. If they're still really lean on the other picture, it might just be a less adapted state. But it is not uncommon at all. So, like, for example, for a bodybuilder to be at the end of the off season before they start their diet, they're in a slight surplus trying to gain muscle mass, and they're, let's say, 15 kilos heavier than they're going to be on stage. The disparity between their highest the calories get in the off season versus the lowest they get, even with a non-extreme approach, relatively for bodybuilding, really kind of no such thing. But what you need to do to get in shape could be a 2,000 calorie difference in the same person. And that sounds wild because it's like, but I'm still me. But it's like, yeah, but you weigh 15 kilos less. Yeah. And you're in a massive deficit, and you're pushing your body to the extremes of adaptive thermogenesis, which is the probably more accurate terminology for metabolic adaptation, at least so people don't think of the same colloquial messages that are a little misconstrued in, like, Instagram, for example. So we definitely have like metabolic adaptation is a real thing. And the simplest definition is simply that your calculated energy expenditure for your body mass is lower or higher than anticipated for reasons that are not explained by changes in body mass.
Okay.
Right? And if we simply look at it that way, then we can understand that this could come from, adaptations in various compartments of TDE, total daily energy expenditure. Mm-hmm. So whether someone is actually experiencing, down regulations in their basal metabolic rate, probably not. And if it is, to a small degree, but this marries up quite nicely with the constrained energy model. And it marries quite nicely even more when you then start thinking about low energy availability and REDS, relative energy deficiency in sport. And those are all the same concept. They're just different research groups, different research backgrounds, kind of looking at the same elephant, and feeling it. And they're, kind of that old parable of the blind person, trying to describe an elephant and getting something a little different. In the REDS research, they're more concerned with the negative effects on health, like the female athlete triad, decrements in performance, frequency of illness, rather than necessarily the energetics. In the metabolic adaptation and obesity research world, they're more focused on the energetics and how does that impact likelihood of success, and how long will a weight-reduced person have a depressed energy expenditure. Then in the constrained energy model, they're more interested in what's the interplay between NEAT and exercise activity and total daily energy expenditure, and how do we explain why it is constrained and it's not a purely additive model. Kind of the Poncer research, right? And, when you're comparing the Hadza, who is, a hunter-gatherer tribe, to a Western culture, you're also comparing someone with severe metabolic adaptation who's really lean doing a high level of activity. It's actually quite similar to your athlete with REDS when you think about it. Your hypogonadal male hunter-gatherer, it's kind of the natural state until you have a post-agricultural society with much more readily available food, is that your body's going to be doing what it can to conserve energy, which makes sense. And it's a positive adaptation. It's not, quote-unquote, metabolic damage or something like that. And it is also transient. And the one thing that reverse dieting gets right is really the only way to fix that is to eat more. And or potentially burn less calories if you're someone who's doing a ton of exercise. But there are, of course, bounds to that. And if you're always in the mindset of, well, I need to eat more so eventually I can eat less so I can finally get the body of my dreams, like that's really just a mild form of extended bulimia and cyclical dieting. And it's often driven by negative things.
Yeah.
And I think we often look to the bodybuilding world, the competitive bodybuilding world, because they should be the masters of knowing what they need to do to improve body composition. And I don't want to look like that, but I'd like to look maybe 10% like that. I often hear that from people who are interested in bodybuilding for the information. But I think people forget that bodybuilders are forced into cyclical dieting by the nature of their sport. Our in-season, for example, I'm 6 feet tall, and I'm currently right now 94 kilos in the off-season. I have to get down to 80 kilos to get on stage, and no one would look at me right now and go, oh, mate, you could lose 14 kilos. If I told them I had to lose 14 kilos and they looked at me naked, they'd be like, so are you getting anything amputated? Like, I'm not like super shredded or anything like that, but I'm athletically, lean right now. And just the extremities of how lean you have to get and the adaptations you go through and how negative of a hormonal and mental and physical environment that is at the end. It's completely non-conducive to gaining muscle. So the natural response and actually the intelligent response is to get out of that state, refeed, regain body weight. And then if you want to compete back-to-back years, you've got, a year before you have to start dieting again. And that year is spent recovering from the trauma of prep that you've done to your body and then hopefully trying to put on new muscle tissue. So it needs to look like this cyclical process of cutting and bulking. But that's probably not the way, not even probably, it's definitely not the way that the average person should approach their body composition goals. It should be a much less extreme version of that. Like, sure, you want to be in a surplus if you're going through a muscle gaining phase. And if you need to therefore clean up a little bit, you need to be at a deficit. But the length of those, the severity of them, the frequency of them should be much more tailored to the individual and ensuring that mental health sustainability is in play and that you're not trying to get too lean and that you're not, following the seafood diet. That's SEE when you're trying to bulk and all that good stuff. So, yeah.
I think there's good rationale too for. I mean, we see plenty of case examples of it, right? Of people who don't do anything cyclical with their nutrition or really training. They're training progressively, progressively improving their strength. They're also exercising other aspects of that sort of fitness paradigm, and they eat, a good healthy diet that is repleted in all those nutrients, and they slowly gain muscle over many years. They have a relatively lean, body, so they're an athletic sort of shape, which I think most people in the mainstream would probably aspire to. And so, I would pose this question, do a lot of people in the mainstream really need to worry about that next level of nuance when they're perhaps not taking care of just the consistency of training and nutritional lifestyle?
No.
And just for the record, I do want to say as well that currently I'm 5'9" and 92 kilos. So just put that in perspective next to Dr. Eric Helms.
Bigger. It's bigger.
For the first time in my life. This is the whole reason I came on the show.
Just to have better stats than me.
Okay, so can I ask you something else then? Because on the flip side...
No.
I suppose we'll just end.
That's it. We're done.
It.
We're done here.
I want to end it on having more muscle than Eric.
Yeah.
I don't know that because I might be a lot fatter. So I have more mass. This is not necessarily muscle mass.
We should have a live DEXA next time, Mikki. That should be the next podcast.
Is DEXA accurate enough, though?
But please ask your question.
MRI. Anyway, so the other thing that I see quite a lot, and maybe this is always just the people that for some reason my feed is now filled, and I love it, with like these not at all pro wannabe bodybuilders who use cutting and bulking in everyday life just as their dieting, and that's just what they do. They never compete, but it's all macros and reverse dieting and bulking and cutting. But then on the flip side, I also have a lot of people in my feed that are absolutely adamant that low calorie diets are to be avoided at all costs. And if you're not losing weight on whatever calories you're following, then obviously they're too low and you need to eat more. I have so many people coming to me saying, I think I need to eat more. And actually they don't. They still actually need to eat less, and maybe less than what they're eating. So I suppose, what do you think about the idea? What are your thoughts on that notion that no one should be on a 1,500 calorie a day diet, for example? Is 1,500 calories too low for everyone? And does everyone really need to eat more to, I don't know, lose more?
I think the last time we chatted, Mikki, I might have been leaning up a little bit because for the first time in my life, my waist measurement was more than half of my height. So I thought, I've got to get that down again. And so I dieted hard for just a couple of weeks, stripped off a bit of body fat, then went back to normal and everything's fine. But it was interesting because I was talking to a prospective student and he was raging about this idea that, some people when they diet, they, drop 1,000 calories off their daily maintenance and all this kind of stuff. And I said, dude, I'm pretty much doing that. I'm eating like 1,100 calories a day or something right now, like a ridiculously low amount. But I had a plan. It was progressive. I was basically dropping to a very low level, preserving as much protein as I could, all that kind of stuff, because I figure I had enough fat to burn. I think I'm a pretty good fat burner. So why not just sort of preserve nutrients, micronutrients, protein, all that kind of stuff, as long as there is some return to play strategy, right? You're not just going to stay there forever. And if if you do get to a point where you are, falling, into that sort of metabolic adaptation down, then there's going to be a point where you've got to start bringing it back up again, because there's a point with, and here's the thing, I think with people sort of look at metabolic adaptation as being this bad thing, right? But as Eric said, this is a natural survival tool that we have, right? And so what that's going to mean is there is a range within which any person's energy intake could be at any given point. And that's fine. Like if it's a couple of hundred higher or lower, it doesn't really matter. And so I think we need to get out of the idea that there is a perfect amount of calories for anyone at any given time, because it simply doesn't matter. What matters is, are you progressing towards your goals, and how do you feel outside of that? So I would only consider it a negative thing, the number that we see in terms of energy intake, if it's affecting someone's hormonal balance as it could, if it's affecting their quality of life in terms of fatigue, their mental health, the other things we might see associated with, say, REDS as well. And so there you're basically looking at what the functional outcomes are for that person. And if everything's going along fine, like, who cares what the number says? Because there's also a lot of things that impact that people typically don't think about, because it's all about energy. So I saw there was an interesting study posted up in one of the groups I'm part of the other day, and it was, okay, so the conclusion of the study was basically that high protein, low carb diets reduce testosterone.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So I looked into this study a little bit more. The moderate protein, low carb diets didn't do that. So I'm thinking, hey, this looks like an artifact to me. And this is basically, from my point of view, this appears that what you're basically seeing is a proxy situation of low energy availability. Because if you have a moderate protein, low carb diet that's not resulting in that outcome, and a high protein, low carb diet that is, then what's going to be the difference? It's going to be the fat intake. So we're basically looking at, we've got 3 macros, one of which we don't really use that efficiently for fuel, and the other 2 we do. So if you drop either of those, if you drop fat considerably or carbs considerably, you're going to see an effect on T, right? So it's not about the protein, it's about the energy availability again. So people need to also consider that, because there's going to be a different amount of energy availability based on your macro split too. Sorry, that got tangential, but
no, good.
That's what we're here for.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I would have much less of an issue with people having these kind of arbitrary, you don't want to ever go below this calorie intake, if it was energy availability statements, which you can technically mathematically calculate as your energy intake minus your exercise energy activity divided by your kilograms of lean body mass. And if someone was like, you know what, I really don't think, even for short periods, you should go below 20, I'd be like, fair enough, But it's temporal too, right? Because you could not eat for a week and it wouldn't matter. Fair enough is the best you're going to get out of me. Not like I totally wholesale agree with that, because 100%, there are every other day fasting protocols, right, that are fine. There are 5 and 2 diets that are fine, where on those 2 days, you don't eat most of the time, where it's like 500 calories, It has to do with, what is your current body fatness? What is your history of dieting? Have you been dieting previously? Is this a cyclical? Are you kind of in and out of 1,500 calories all the goddamn time? That's very different from, I decided for 4 weeks to do a 1,500 calorie week, diet after years of, being in a normal thing. Because I just want to clean up a little bit and get back to it. I see no issue with that.
Yeah.
The effects are transient, and, it might not be fun, but you'll be probably in most cases back to normal within a few weeks.
Albeit leaner.
Yes, maybe until you regain it all. But it depends on, what's the motivation for going into it? Why are you doing it? Are you trying to live there because you want to stay unsustainably lean? That's the real issue, not some arbitrary energy intake. If we had a message for, athletes who needed to sustain a high level of performance, but also wanted to try to get leaned up, versus someone like, Cliff and I, who are quote unquote athletes, it might be a little different. I would, for example, if I was to consult, and I have occasionally, which is not my main purpose, but when I consult with high energy output athletes who are also trying to change body composition, you're walking a much finer line, right? Because you're needing to support performance and, not expose them to injury risk while also trying to lean up a little bit. And you're leveraging a high energy output, higher flux situation anyway, and you wouldn't just be like, oh, let's get this done and dusted and lose a lot of weight. So with a low energy intake. So I think the context is incredibly important here. And most of the time, the problem is not how low did your calories get during your cut. It's how frequently you're cutting. What is the motivation behind the fact that you're cutting? And are you living in this kind of semi-chronically dieted state? And to go back to an earlier aspect of your question, Mikki, it's kind of like the idea of, physiologically, if you're not losing weight, you are eating, too high to continue to lose weight. But in the real world, what happens is someone goes on a 1,500 calorie diet, or we'll just say a very low calorie diet, because they want to get leaner. Yeah. They can't sustain it. They binge eat, and they compensate for that. And they are finding themselves in this very unhealthy cycle. And that's of course not ideal. And typically it's motivated by the same things that we're seeing on Instagram, unrealistic bodies who are giving partial sides of the story, societal pressures to look a certain way.
Yeah.
They have a history of dieting. They don't have a healthy relationship with food or their body. And those are the problems, not the actual X's and O's of their nutrition plan for a certain phase of when they're dieting.
And one thing that, sorry, Mick, one thing that I think as well, now I'm not sure if there's a lot of strong evidence for this, but I know that it's often sort of rallied against by the ostensibly evidence-based crowd, is that I think that pattern of eating is particularly obesogenic anyway, right? If you are eating a set amount of calories every day and it's coming from foods that are nutrient replete, highly satiating, all that kind of stuff, versus you're going through those periods of what amounts to starvation and binging. The binging is typically with foods that we would consider to be obesogenic, but I think they are uniquely that, not just because of the behavioral ramifications. Right. And why I say that is I think we can see enough indications in the research that there are these sort of states of what we might consider, benevolent pseudo-diabetes, but I don't think that would necessarily be benevolent if we are compensating for under-eating by just loading up on a whole bunch of sugar, for example. So if every 3 days I'm just getting past my limits, and let's say I'm at energy balance, but I'm achieving that by every 3 days loading up on 500 grams of sugar in a couple of sittings, I wonder, and I would suspect that that's going to be more obesogenic than if I were just consistently eating, let's say a healthy diet across the board that was isocaloric.
However, as well, alongside that is the because what you're talking about there with that cyclic calories, like if you were cycling calories but were more deliberate, and in fact your higher calorie intake included more nutrient rich foods, then you wouldn't be having all the then you would largely mitigate that sort of obesogenic sort of environment. So I think the to your point,
possibly, and I'm not saying it's a big effect.
No.
I'm saying, but I think there could be an effect. Yeah.
And actually, that sort of speaks to your earlier point, Cliff, about having a game plan. Like, yes, you're in this short-term caloric deficit, knowing that you're going to be sort of bringing yourself back to a new maintenance. But so I think that both of you have said the same thing: is that you need that sort of recovery into a higher caloric intake, be it after 4 weeks, be it the diet break at the weekend, or the 3 days out of every 4 that you're not alternate day fasting, that kind of thing. That's probably a better sort of approach.
Yeah, you will, if you look at long-term, quote-unquote, intermittent fasting research, and I say quote-unquote because if you're connected to the fitness marketing, and just it's probably not marketing is the right word, the colloquial terminology in fitness space versus the research on this. Intermittent fasting, people think of it as time-restricted feeding, which is, but if you look at the research, intermittent fasting encompasses a whole lot of things, like you mentioned, alternate day fasting, 5 and 2 diet, time-restricted feeding, chronobiological manipulations of feeding times, etc. Any time where you're comparing continuous dieting to an approach where you are purposefully and intentionally with a plan on a specific schedule with specific criteria, manipulating cyclically your diet, you see very different long-term outcomes. You generally see positive and equivalent, on average, outcomes to chronic dieting with a continuous day-to-day restriction. However, when you look at diet cycling, or I should say, that's not the word I'm looking for, cyclical weight regain, which is that's not an intervention, it's an outcome, and an unintended one most of the time. It is correlated, it prospectively predicts weight gain and long-term higher rates of obesity and overweight. So those are two very different things, and this has been known for a while, that if you try to simulate a break in your diet with a diet break, you don't get the same outcomes. People don't start gaining weight. You don't have the same psychological reaction. And when you think about it, if for anyone who has dieted and they have fallen off the wagon, that's not something you plan for that day. You typically have, ideally not, but often people have a shame response to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there is compensatory behavior that could even, resemble bulimia that goes on with that. And bulimia doesn't necessarily, just for the record, have to be vomiting. It could be excessive exercise afterwards, or just restrictive dieting to a great degree. So I think that is a very, very different animal than taking an intermittent fasting approach to either. I'm not a huge fan of that for kind of general like maintenance nutrition for most people. I'm not dismissing it out of hand, but I've just seen too many times that is kind of covering up some greater issues. But I would, if I was to be purely research based with the kind of timeframes that we have, which are typically not longer than 6 months, they seem to be equivalent on average to a continuous approach.
Now that's a really good point, because I think it sort of plays into a lot of the narrative that we see where certain things are either deified or they're trash. So many times I'll see on, particularly strength and hypertrophy sort of forums and groups and things, this idea that intermittent fasting sucks. Keto sucks. And I'm sort of the first to jump in there and say, well, it has its uses, but we've got to be clear about what that is. And as, you and I have discussed, Mikki, and I've been very vocal about the last couple of years, probably most of the people that come to me as clients who are currently intermittent fasting, we kind of figure out it's not appropriate for them because they end up under-eating, right? So they're auto-regulating their calorie intake down too far, and that's resulting in all sorts of things, maybe IBS, maybe, fatigue, maybe mental health challenges, whatever it happens to be. And we find when we increase their energy by adding a meal back in, great. However, the person needs to auto-regulate their energy intake down. Fasting could be a great option for them, just like keto might be, or an extremely high-carb, low-fat diet that's really high in vegetable bulk, which, as Hall and others have shown, is, equivalent or better than a keto diet in terms of its satiety effects and whatnot. So it's really about horses for courses, and I think that I know I'm saying that to two people who understand it, and I think most of your listeners, Mikki, would get that, but it still seems to be something that is not really accepted because there is this evidence-based position, which isn't evidence-based. That's just taking kind of groupthink. It's like tribalism around what people think is evidence-based.
I think it comes because it operates, a lot of the evidence-based practitioners, like myself included, operate in the bodybuilding space, where it is either I can conceive it as optimal or it's useless. So you show me something that requires a different kind of effort than normal, or what's already been established, or additional effort, or that could have theoretical downsides and is not better. They're like no significant difference between groups. Like, oh, look at that. Another study that showed keto wasn't better. Keto's trash. And I'm like, wait. Neither one was better. That's non-significant differences between group. How is one trash? They're equivalent. Well, they're not equivalent technically, but they're at least not different in this variable you're talking about. And I think the issue is not the issue is that mindset of viewing things as I need the best thing rather than viewing things as potential tools in different circumstances. For sure.
Yeah, and we see that with a lot of things. Like obviously, we see that with MCTs. I know a lot of people are very derisive about MCTs. Why would you add fat to your diet? You're an idiot. It's like, well, if I'm applying that with a post-TBI patient, I personally believe there's a lot of benefit there, and I think there's a lot of research to back that up.
Yeah.
One of the case studies I'm going to be publishing soon, because I've got into sort of publishing a few medical cases because I think they're interesting hypothesis generators. We've seen some really interesting results with post-TBI patients in sleep. Now, there's evidence to suggest that from infants, where MCTs added to infant formula improves their sleep. Now, in the energy crisis in the brain that results from TBI, MCTs we've found clinically to be really effective for improving sleep quality, right? So we'll publish that. We might end up doing some RCTs on it. Great. We're going to add to the body of evidence. But it's just an indication that when we say something is useless, it's really myopic to do that, because there are cases within which that might be useful, right? So long as there is evidence to support that. And I think, what we need to often consider within the realm of either clinical or performance nutrition is that I talk about this with, a lot of medical conferences and things. I say, when we're treating a condition, we've got to remember that we're treating a person. When we're working with an athlete, we've got to understand that they're a person who may have conditions. So there is some degree of crossover for which there are going to be different tools that we apply.
Absolutely. So we've sort of touched on a few concepts, one almost entirely unrelated to the rest of the conversation, but still very interesting, cutting and water loading for bodybuilding physique. But the whole idea of metabolic adaptation, where people go wrong, chaos theory isn't necessarily bad, and then using these tools for fat loss, but bearing in mind that those the outcomes are all sort of working in favor for the person, and it's not, impacting negatively on their mental health or their sort of metabolic outcome and things like that. Guys, can we just finish up with what your practical advice would be for someone coming to you just actually for they're wanting improvement in body composition, they're wanting to lose weight? Like, I just am really interested to see where you align, and potentially if you do differ, bearing in mind that, we all come at it with our own perspective and expertise, and it doesn't make it right or wrong, it's just different. And so for me, when I'm working with people, I take a few different approaches, but one which I'm using in my plans is the almost like a fasting protocol within an overall sort of general diet approach, whereby I'm using protein-sparing modified fast a few times a week, where they're in a fast one day, they're out of the fast for a couple of days, they're back in it. Whereas overall, their sort of the baseline diet is one which is protein rich, an abundance of vegetables. We have diet breaks, and they get to practice what it might be like to be within maintenance calories across the course of a general sort of period. So, it's using the tools of protein sparing modified fast within a relatively sustainable approach, if you like. What do you guys generally do?
Well, first off, for the record, I'm not taking on like a lot of new clients. Generally, they're not just like, hey, I'm a fat loss client. They typically have a purpose or a goal. But that's not to say that I don't have a lot of experience with this. So just a little bit of a caveat, I guess. But they tend to be highly individualized. So, if someone comes to me and their desire is to lose fat, we're going to end up having an hour-long conversation that is kind of like motivational interviewing, where I want to fully understand what their motivation for that is, and often see if, not that I'm trying to manipulate them, but see how well they understand their own motivation for that as well. And I also want to understand what was their background with that. How many times have they tried? Is this weight that they've tried to lose multiple times? Is this weight that I think from a physiological perspective will be maintained easily, or will be maintained with needing to manipulate things because they're going to be in a weight-reduced state and a little bit on the whole red side of things, which, depending on the person, like I said, the hunter-gatherers in the Hazada tribe, they're always in a slightly weight-reduced state. It would be, so it's not like you can't live like that, but I just want to make sure the person knows what they're signing up for, and that they haven't repeatedly failed to. I'll give an example of the common male goal that's based on arbitrary numbers that are not helpful or useful. I want to be 10% body fat, So this idea, which may or may not be actual 10% body fat, but really just has to do with a certain look. If they've attempted to accomplish that 6 times in a row and failed each time, and really just damaged their own self-efficacy and their health potentially, at least transiently, then the approach will be very different than someone who has a much different perspective. My work got crazy for a couple years. I've always been an athlete, but I've only been able to train a couple of days per week, and I've now been able to shift my workload. And my kids are now, they're out of the house, so I have the time to work out 4 days a week, and I'd like to get back to 20 pounds ago. And I know I can maintain that. I did for years. Like, those are going to be 2 very different approaches, even if it's the same stats on the person physically. That's just one huge caveat. And then from there, I think I would be asking questions related to what worked in the past. They don't have the information. What do they think is currently making it harder for them to be where they want to be currently? And then some of the things that will be similar is we are probably going to be leveraging a sufficiently high protein intake, resistance training, and then some combination of a reduction in fat, carbohydrates, or calories, or increasing energy expenditure. But how we get there can look very different. If someone is like, yeah, I've been tracking on macro factor for 6 months, I love it, and I love, check out this 4-page spreadsheet I have, it's amazing.
Those people exist.
Oh, 100%. Like, if you've ever helped an engineer lose fat, they love numbers. They are all about it. And that idea of tracking can be deleterious. It's like they're enjoying this process. This is they're gamifying it,
Yeah.
But for other people, they feel like they need to track. And sometimes you may need to do some type of an energy audit, but they've never explored approaches that should result in a lower energy intake and a net energy negative balance without actually tracking. And those folks, I think a lot more about meal structuring, environment changes. Like, hey, let's go to the grocery store together. Like, let me see what you buy. Like, how are your cooking skills? Do you like fruits and vegetables? And doing a lot of the stuff that Cliff talked about earlier about trying to result in a auto-regulation of food intake that would result in at least an initial deficit before they then stabilize at a lower body weight. Trying to get people to consume. Sometimes, people ask me like, hey, I want to lose some weight. What should I cut out of my diet, or what should I do? And my first, if I just meet you in the hallway for like 5 minutes and you want to clean up your diet and I'm not looking at you and you're like, oh my God, you're already shredded or something like that. I'd be like, try to get in 5 servings of fruit and 5 servings of vegetable a day and consume protein every time you sit down to eat a meal, like a lean protein source. And I know just doing that, there's no potential downside. I haven't required them to restrict anything out of their diet. And if they're going to do that, it's going to be really challenging to maintain a high energy intake in most cases.
Yeah.
And then, of course, go lift some weights. So,
yeah, nice.
So I guess that's not what I would do for everyone. But my point is that some people, they might be on here's your, gram targets for fat, carbohydrates, and protein, and, get out your Fitbit and we're going to track your steps, Mr. or Mrs. Engineer. Or it might be, hey, let's create some skills and some habits in a food environment that should push you towards an energy deficit that won't stress you out because maybe you're absolutely not the engineer. You're an artist or something like that, or you really have no experience with nutrition until now. And it needs to be much more about real foods, times, concepts, cooking, and kind of the tangible experience of what it's going to be like to change my lifestyle.
Yeah, nice. Thanks, Eric. And how about you, Cliff?
Yeah, I mean, that resonates because obviously I'm working with people. I'm actually working with fewer people nowadays anyway. And those that I do work with, I don't tend to see just pure sort of weight or fat loss clients much at all anymore. Most of the people I work with are fairly intractable cases. So they're complex cases looking at various autoimmune conditions predominantly, obviously cancer patients and things like that as well. But, for many of those people, again, it's not about working with a condition. It's about working with an individual. And many of them do have other comorbidities, metabolic disorder, they're with obesity, things like that. And also having worked a lot with people with morbid obesity in the past, I've got a fair amount of experience in this space. And I think Eric's bang on. One of the things that I think is often lacking is the coaching approach. So it's not just about, someone comes to you with a goal. It's not just about immediately meeting that goal and trying to find solutions. It's about trying to understand why the person has that goal, have them understand their why, have them understand their own process towards that goal, assuming the goal is actually the correct one. I've had people come to me and say, I want to run a marathon. It's like, oh, cool. Why do you want to do that? Well, I want to have more energy so I can, hang out with my kids and be a better father and all this kind of stuff. It's like, well, okay, cool. Let's talk about whether a marathon's the best way to get that.
You're not going to be hanging out with anybody if you're praying for a marathon. You're going to be out there running like 10 hours a week. Yeah.
Exactly. So people will often find, again, we when we don't have a goal, we feel that we lack direction. So often we will then want to find direction through a goal. And it's almost as if we have all these things swirling around us and we grab one. So, well, I'm going to do that because it's going to give me some direction. Maybe it's not the right direction. So I think what Eric said about starting from that sort of coaching approach is really critical. From there, obviously there are going to be different tools that could be applied to the individual, because as Eric said, some people love tracking, some don't. Some people want a really quantified plan, others want a more qualitative approach. But I think there are some consistencies across the board. I would tend to say for most people, well, not most people, for everybody, if they're going to have the best outcomes over their lifespan, there needs to be some progressive resistance training. There probably should be other activity around that as well, residual activity, activities in different movement planes. But as an absolute must-have, I think that progressive approach to resistance is really important. So that's something I often work with, my clients on. And it could be very simple. It could be about doing one set of push-ups, pull-ups, and squats every day. Right, it could be that simple, or it could be getting into the gym twice a week if that's all the time you have for. But it is about having that as a sort of absolute must do. Outside of that, I tend to build it up from qualitative into quantitative. So the quality approach being really that let's look at a compendium of food that is more unrefined. And so we start to differentiate between the ultra refined hyperpalatable foods and the unrefined foods, not in the way of it's good or bad. It's just that, hey, for most people, most of the time, they're not actually eating for sort of innate enjoyment or social satisfaction. They're eating through the day. And those unrefined foods can be equally pleasurable. They're just different in terms of the pleasure. If I'm going out for a burger, I want to just be able to enjoy the burger without thinking, well, I'm going to have the lettuce bun and the low carb option and the no sauce and all this kind of stuff, because I'm just going to enjoy it, right? But through a lot of my day, it doesn't matter. So we talk about that in terms of a quality approach, and then really try and set the idea around the health environment, right? So all the things that we can do somewhat easily with simple tactical behavioral changes that might improve like our sleep, and that might reduce our stress, because all of those are going to be conducive to that auto-regulation side of things. And then in terms of the actual nuts and bolts of nutrition itself, I think, again, there's a couple of things that are going to come into that. They become finer and finer as you go down the track. But I think prioritizing protein in meals, critically important. Increasing vegetables. I tend to take a modular approach to meal planning, just because it gives people a mind's eye view of what a meal should look like. And this is, even if we are going to quantify further down the track, we still talk about, well, if you can't quantify or if you can't track, what might a meal look like? Well, a good idea would be maybe 1 to 2 palm sizes of protein, maybe 3 fist sizes of veggies, maybe 1 or 2 thumb sizes of fat, depending on what your macro split's going to look like. And then carbs obviously allocated according to the person, their activity requirements, all that kind of stuff. So it's getting that sort of mind's eye view of what a meal might look like. And the one final thing that I often talk about, and it's not an absolute because some people thrive on snacks, but I tend to say for most people, most of the time, I think meals are better than snacks. If you snack, that's fine, but understanding that, most of the research does show us that snacking behaviors trend towards being with overweight or obesity. Just because the snacking choices are typically poorer, they're less conscious, they're more prone to other lifestyle impacts. For example, when we look at sleep, it tends to have a much bigger impact on snacks rather than meals, because meals are very habitual, right? We tend to create our meals in the same way most days, whereas snacks are much more, what's the sort of term? They're much more elective in terms of what we do, right? So if we haven't slept enough or we're really stressed, we might tend towards the high sugar stuff, rather than grabbing a carrot or a piece of jerky or whatever. So really it's about setting that health environment to allow for auto-regulation first. Hopefully that allows for a lot of these things to sort of occur, and then we can quantify down the track as we need to.
Yeah. No, that's awesome, guys. And I always like when I'm on the same page-ish with two gurus, and particularly because neither of you have said, I'm taking on weight loss clients. At least you know that. See, I am. So if we're all on the same page, they're basically going to get the same advice from me that they would get from either of you. So
I'm no guru, Mick. I know a little bit about what I know, and that's about it. I can help a few people here and there.
Well, that's what being a guru is.
I'm definitely a guru. I know more than everyone else. on all things. So, yes.
On all things. All right. So to finish up, like is there anything that I just would love to hear from both of you? Like, what are you most excited about right now in terms of what you're learning about, which could be absolutely unrelated to what we've been talking about today, which is something which I think a lot about with, weight loss for the general population. So what's really spinning your wheels?
Oh man, I'm keeping myself up at night thinking about how we can improve basically our health environment. I think that we have some real challenges there, and it's deeply embedded in our socioeconomic system. So sort of looking at how we can potentially impact that, because, we can talk about, weight loss, we can talk about fat loss, we can talk about health in somewhat arbitrary terms, but, we face a number of crises right now. We've got pandemics, we've got, an obesity epidemic. Let's, be clear about it. We have an epidemic of metabolic syndrome, but more than that, we've got an epidemic of mental health challenges. We've got a real milieu of health things that are going on that are really not positive. And outside of that, we've also got, massive changes happening because of climate and geopolitical things happening in the world right now. And I think that's all part and parcel of the same thing. And so really, I'm excited about maybe just helping to steer the boat in a better direction, where maybe we don't think so much about what we have, and think a little bit more about who we really want to be and how we treat each other better.
That's boring. I'm really interested in whether training at longer muscle lengths can enhance distal hypertrophy. So
see, that was my beauty pageant answer. I just want to feed the children.
You definitely won the the virtues have all been signaled to all the people. You did it. So. I think that's, of course, I agree. I mean, we've got COVID, war in Ukraine, and all kinds of crazy shit going on at the moment. But I'm just out here trying to get jacked, and more jacked than jacked as well.
Can I revise my answer?
You want to be more jacked than
you're
Eric?
stuck. No,
I just want to be jacked.
Yeah.
No, but in all seriousness, yeah. What I often think about is, how do people have long-term careers in sport and leave it feeling satisfied and accomplished? Because I think there's a lot of people who leave it because they doesn't quite feel the same way. They no longer were competitive at the level they wanted, and that was maybe at a certain point became the only thing they were extracting from the sport, instead of fostering a long-term relationship, finding meaning in the sport. How do people get to enter and leave sports on their own terms rather than burnouts or injury, things like that? So, yeah, there's a lot of bodies in strength and physique sport, and sport in general. I shouldn't throw my own people under the bus too much. So I'm very interested in how do you foster both high performance but also sustainable long-term careers, and that's something I'm always thinking about. Yeah,
awesome.
That's a super cool idea. I've been thinking about that a lot. I'm actually co-writing a book at the moment with Darren Ellis about we're sort of working title is Awesome After 40. And it's just playing with a lot of those ideas, and a lot of it sort of drawn from my perspective, at least, from the things I didn't do when I was younger. I rushed. I wanted to be as strong as I could be now, rather than thinking about what's going to provide for the foundation for strength later on, and, what's going to provide for the best health later on, which would then therefore allow me to have a longer career in strength sports, or just to be, have more structural integrity at this age, and not have maybe the injuries that I've sustained and things like that. So I'm really interested in that idea too, and it's a really cool little experiment now to really be trying to put the body back together and enact those things now that probably should have been done at 22.
Nice. Well, team, as I expected, we've covered in detail, like probably a third of the
Nothing.
things which I sort of wanted to chat about. But you're right, actually. Now I'm thinking about it. What the hell did you talk about for an hour 40? I don't know, but I'm going to have to listen back to find out. And I'm sure I'll be like, I'll feel more informed for it, as I always would after chatting to you. Thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
It was a pleasure.
Thanks, Mick. Thanks, Eric.
It's an honor. Thank you. Great to be talking to both of you.
Alrighty, hopefully you enjoyed that, and you may need to go back and jot down some notes because they shared a lot of super practical information on that, in addition to just sort of allowing you to be a fly on the wall for the types of conversations that we might have every week when we sit down and chat together. Next week on the podcast team, I'm really stoked to bring to you the conversation that I have with Professor Dorothy Sears. Her and I talk about her research in metabolism and breast cancer and other metabolic conditions. Until then, though, you can catch me over on Facebook at Mikki Williden Nutrition, over on Twitter and Instagram at Mikki Williden, or hop on to my website where, in addition to the plans that I mentioned earlier, you can book me for a one-on-one consultation, mikkiwilliden.com. All right, team, you have a great week. Look forward to catching up with you next week. See you later.